What would you risk for a complete stranger? For a man your people have been taught to hate. In the unforgiving heart of the American West, a lone woman driving a wagon toward a new life stumbles upon a man left for dead in the dust. Her decision to help him to hide him beneath the floorboards of her future is an act of simple compassion. She has no idea the man bleeding out in her sanctuary is Nantan, the only son and heir to the formidable Apache chief Mangus. She doesn't know her simple act of kindness has just lit the fuse on a powder keg of vengeance, greed, and forbidden love that could set the entire territory ablaze. This is the story of that choice and the fire it ignited. The sun was a merciless hammer in the Arizona Territory of 1878, beating down on the canvas of Catherine Moreau's wagon until the air inside was thick and suffocating. Dust, fine as powdered cinnamon, coated everything. Her hands, her worn calico dress, the cherished photograph of her late husband, Thomas, propped against a sack of flour. For 3 weeks, she had been a solitary ship on this vast ochre ocean. Her only companions, the 2 sturdy mules, Cain and Abel, and the ghosts of the life she'd left behind in St. Louis. Thomas had been a man of books and quiet smiles, not of open plains and survival. When consumption took him, it took Catherine's world with it, leaving her adrift in a society that had little room for a childless widow of 28. Her brother's offer of a home in Prescott was less an invitation than a summons to a life of genteel servitude, a future of pouring tea for his wife and fading into the wallpaper. So she had sold what little she and Thomas had owned, purchased the wagon and supplies, and set her face west. It was a reckless, desperate gamble, a flight toward an unknown freedom that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The trail was a brutal teacher. It taught her the language of the wagon's groans, the subtle shift in the mule's gait that signaled exhaustion, and the profound, soul-deep loneliness of a silent horizon. It was on the precipice of that loneliness, with the Dragoon Mountains looming like purple spectres in the distance, that she found him. At first she thought he was a bundle of discarded rags, a casualty of the trail. Then she saw the twitch of a hand, the glint of obsidian hair matted with blood and dirt. She pulled Cain and Abel to a halt, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The man was Apache. Every warning she had ever heard, every campfire tale of savagery and violence, screamed at her to whip the mules and drive on. The papers back east were filled with stories of raids and scalpings. The people in the last settlement, she'd passed a miserable collection of tents called Dusty Creek, had spoken of the Apache with a mixture of fear and venomous hatred. They were ghosts, savages, less than human. But the man on the ground was no ghost. He was flesh and blood, and his blood was staining the parched earth a dark, ugly crimson. Cautiously, Catherine climbed down from the driver's seat, her old rifle in hand. It was heavy and awkward, and she prayed she wouldn't have to use it. He lay on his side, his face turned away from her. He wore buckskin leggings and was naked from the waist up, his bronze skin a canvas of deep cuts and angry bruises. A dark, wet patch seeped from his side, a wound that looked dangerously deep. His breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. He couldn't have been much older than her. Her mind raced. To leave him was to condemn him to a slow, agonizing death under the uncaring sun. To help him was to invite a danger she couldn't possibly comprehend. What if his people found her? What if white men found her with him? The questions circled like vultures. She knelt beside him, the heat of the ground seeping through her dress. "Mr. She whispered the word, feeling foolish and inadequate. He didn't stir. Gently she reached out and touched his shoulder. His skin was feverishly hot. With a strength born of desperation, she rolled him onto his back. His face was stark and handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, now slack in unconsciousness. Amulets of turquoise and carved bone hung from a leather cord around his neck. He was no mere raider. There was an air of nobility about him even in this broken state. It was the sight of his vulnerability that broke through her fear. He was just a man wounded and alone, same as her in a way. Thomas had always told her that compassion was the truest measure of a soul. In that moment, staring down at the dying Apache, she felt her husband's presence more keenly than she had in months. "Oh Lord, what am I doing?" she breathed to the empty sky. The decision when it came was not a thought, but an impulse, a rebellion against the harshness of the land and the prejudices of its people. She would not leave him. Getting him into the wagon was a Herculean task. He was lean, but his body was dense with muscle, a dead weight that tested every ounce of her strength. She grunted and strained her arms, screaming in protest, half dragging, half lifting him to the wagon's rear. She managed to get him onto the lowered tailgate, then with a final desperate shove, rolled him onto the floorboards. He groaned a low, guttural sound that sent a fresh spike of fear through her. She quickly covered him with a spare canvas tarp, her hands trembling. He had to be hidden, completely. Her wagon was her one advantage. It was a Conestoga, but she had commissioned a false bottom in St. Louis before she left a secret compartment for valuables. A paranoid precaution suggested by a grizzled trapper. It was a space perhaps a foot deep, long enough for a person if they lay perfectly still. It was meant for gold, not men. Working frantically, she pulled up the loose floorboards. The space was dark and smelled of raw pine. It would be an oven in this heat, a coffin. But it was better than the alternative. She eased him down into the cramped compartment, arranging his limbs as gently as she could. His fevered skin felt like fire. She laid the boards back in place, her heart hammering. She slid a heavy crate of tinned goods over the spot, then another of blankets, hoping the weight wasn't too much. The wagon looked as it had before, cluttered but innocent. As she climbed back into the driver's seat and snapped the reins, the weight of her secret felt heavier than the man hidden beneath her feet. The mules plodded forward, pulling her away from the scene of her transgression. Catherine Moreau, the widow from St. Louis, was now a woman with a dangerous secret, heading toward a town called Redemption Gulch, utterly unaware that the life she had saved was that of Nantan, the sole heir to a legacy of defiance, the cherished son of Chief Mangus of the Chiricahua Apache. Her act of mercy had not been a whisper in the dust. It was the first crack of thunder in a coming storm. Redemption Gulch was less a town than a scar on the landscape. A single wide street, ankle-deep in dust or mud, depending on the day, was flanked by a dozen or so raw lumber buildings with false fronts that promised a grandeur the town could never deliver. There was a saloon, the Gilded Cage, a general store, a blacksmith and assayer's office, and at the far end of the street, a small whitewashed building with a simple cross, the sheriff's office and jail. Catherine guided her weary mules down the main thoroughfare, every creak of the wagon wheels setting her teeth on edge. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, the curious, suspicious gazes of miners, prospectors, and hard-faced women who had seen too much of the frontier's ugly side. A lone woman arriving in a wagon was an event, a ripple in the stagnant pool of their daily lives. Beneath the floorboards, her secret passenger had been mostly silent, save for a few low moans that the rumble of the wheels had mercifully disguised. She had stopped once during the night, under the cold light of 1,000 stars, to give him a little water. His lips were cracked and dry, and he'd swallowed greedily, his dark eyes fluttering open for a moment. They were filled with a dazed, feverish confusion, but in them she saw not savagery, but a flicker of profound gratitude that both terrified and strengthened her. She had cleaned his wound as best she could with whiskey, and clean rags, her stomach turning at the torn flesh. It was a bullet wound clean through his side, but the risk of infection was immense. She needed a place to stay, a place with 4 solid walls where she could tend to him in secret. Her gaze settled on a small, dilapidated cabin at the very edge of town, set back from the main road near a stand of gnarled cottonwood trees. A faded "For Rent" sign was nailed crookedly to the door. It was perfect, isolated, unassuming. Her first stop was Abernathy's general store. The proprietor, a balding man named Silas Abernathy, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked her up and down as the bell above the door jingled. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his tone a mix of politeness and undisguised curiosity. "Long way from civilization, ain't ya?" "I'm looking for a new start," Catherine replied, forcing a steady smile. She bought flour, salt, pork, and beans, and most importantly, laudanum carbolic acid and clean bandages. For snakebite, she added, hoping it sounded plausible. Mr. Abernathy raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. He was more interested in the town's newest morsel of gossip. "That little cabin at the edge of town is for rent. Belongs to old man Hemlock, but he's up at the assayer's office most days. Quiet place. A little drafty. Quiet is what I'm looking for," Catherine said. An hour later, the cabin was hers, for a few dollars a month, as dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet. She maneuvered the wagon behind the cabin, out of sight of the main road. The moment she was sure no one was watching, she tore open the hidden compartment. The heat that rose from it was staggering. The man she had started calling him Kalen in her mind, a name from a book she'd once read, as she couldn't keep calling him the Apache, was drenched in sweat, his breathing shallow. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was dead. But then he coughed a weak, rattling sound. Getting him out of the wagon and into the cabin was another agonizing struggle. She half carried, half dragged him onto the simple rope bed, his feverish body leaving a trail of sweat on the dusty floor. In the dim lantern light, she could finally see the full extent of his injuries. The bullet wound in his side was red and inflamed the skin around it, hot to the touch. Ugly bruises shadowed his ribs and torso. For the next 3 days, the world shrank to the size of that small, dusty cabin. Catherine became a nurse, a guardian, a liar. She existed in a state of hyper-vigilance. During the day, she would make brief, necessary trips to the well or the store, forcing herself to be pleasant and unremarkable. All the while, her mind was on the man lying helpless in her bed. At night, she would bolt the door and tend to him. She fed him broth, spooning it carefully between his cracked lips. She cleaned his wound with the carbolic acid, a process that made him clench his fists and hiss through his teeth, but never cry out. She gave him doses of laudanum for the pain, watching as the potent opiate pulled him down into a restless, mumbling sleep. In his delirium, he spoke in a language that was all harsh consonants and soft vowels, words that were meaningless to her, but carried the weight of a life she couldn't imagine. Slowly, miraculously, the fever began to break. On the 4th night, she was bathing his face with a cool cloth when his eyes opened. This time, they were clear. The fever haze was gone, replaced by a sharp, intelligent awareness. He stared at her, his dark gaze intense and unnerving. He tried to sit up, a flash of alarm on his face. "Easy," Catherine soothed, gently pushing him back down. "You're safe. You've been very sick." He didn't seem to understand her words, but he understood the gentleness of her touch. He relaxed slightly, his eyes scanning the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the single window, her worried face. He said something in his own tongue, a question. Catherine could only shake her head. "I don't understand." She pointed to herself. "Catherine." Then she pointed to him. "What's your name?" He watched her, his expression unreadable. He remained silent. Their communication became a pantomime. Hunger was a hand to the mouth. Pain was a grimace and a touch to his side. Despite the chasm between their worlds, a fragile thread of understanding began to weave itself between them. He watched her constantly, his perception keen. He saw the way she clutched the photograph of her husband, at night the weariness in her shoulders. She in turn saw the iron will behind his silence, the pride that even injury and helplessness could not extinguish. Her quiet existence, however, was not to last. On the 5th day, there was a sharp rap on the door. Her blood ran cold. She quickly threw a blanket over the sleeping Kalen, praying he wouldn't make a sound. "Ma'am," a deep voice called out. "Marshal Murdoch, just making a courtesy call to welcome you to Redemption Gulch." Catherine took a deep breath pasted on a smile and opened the door. Marshal Flint Murdoch was a man built to fill a doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and startlingly blue eyes. A thick, sandy-colored mustache framed a mouth that was currently set in a friendly grin. He held his hat in his hands, a picture of frontier courtesy. But his eyes, she noted, missed nothing. They swept over her, then flickered to the interior of the cabin. "Marshal," Catherine said, her voice a little higher than usual. "How kind of you." "Just Flint, ma'am," he said, his smile widening. "It's not often we get a lady of your quality gracing our town. Most folks who end up here are running from something. You don't strike me as the running type." "I'm seeking something, Marshal, not running," she corrected gently. A respectable answer. He chuckled. "Well, I just wanted to let you know if you have any trouble you come see me. The Gulch can be a rough place, and be particularly mindful of the Apache. There's been talk of a Chiricahua war party seen near the dragoons led by the old devil himself, Mangus. They're looking for something, or someone. They're bolder than usual, and I won't have them threatening the good people of this town." Catherine felt a jolt as if lightning had struck the ground beside her. Mangus. The name echoed the fear she'd heard in Dusty Creek. A war party. Looking for someone. Her hand instinctively went to the door frame to steady herself. Murdoch's keen eyes narrowed slightly. "You all right, Mom? You look a little pale." "Just the heat, Marshal," she managed to say. "I'm still not accustomed to it." "Well, don't you worry," he said, placing his hat back on his head. "So long as Flint Murdoch is the law in this town, you'll be safe." He tipped his hat, gave her one last lingering look, and strode away. Catherine closed the door, her back slumping against it. Her safe, secret world had just been breached. The law itself was a threat, and the man lying in her bed was not just an anonymous Apache. He was connected to something far bigger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The name Mangus hung in the air like a death sentence. Her act of compassion was rapidly becoming an act of treason in the eyes of the world, and the shadow of redemption. Gulch suddenly felt like the shadow of the gallows. The marshal's visit changed everything. The fragile peace of Catherine's cabin was shattered, replaced by a constant gnawing anxiety. Every rider who passed, every distant shout, sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She was living on a knife's edge, and the blade was growing sharper by the day. Kaelin, as she continued to call him in her thoughts, was healing. The enforced stillness was clearly a torment to him, but he bore it with a stoic patience that awed her. His body, honed by a life she could scarcely imagine, fought off the infection with remarkable speed. The angry red around his wound began to fade, and the deep well of exhaustion in his eyes was slowly replaced by a bright, vital fire. He was beginning to move around the small cabin, his steps silent as a cat's. He would stand for long periods at the single grimy window, peering out from behind the curtain at the world that considered him an enemy. She wondered what he was thinking, what he saw. Did he see the harsh beauty of the landscape as she sometimes did? Or did he only see the cage? Their communication evolved. He began to learn a few words of English, pointing to objects with a questioning look. Water, bread, blanket. He spoke them with a guttural accent, his brow furrowed in concentration. In return, he taught her his words. Hadentin for corn, tu for water, nde for the people. He never said his own name. When she pointed to him and said, Kaelin, a name she had plucked from a book of romantic poetry, he would simply give a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. A silent correction she didn't understand. In these quiet moments, the wall between captor and captive nurse and patient, white and Apache, began to crumble. She saw not a savage, but a man of deep intelligence and quiet dignity. He showed her how to properly sharpen her skinning knife, his large, capable hands guiding hers. One evening, he took a piece of charcoal from the cold hearth and on a spare piece of wood drew a stunningly accurate map of the surrounding mountains and valleys, marking water sources and hidden passes with deft strokes. It was a map born of intimate knowledge of a life lived in harmony with the land she found so hostile. She in turn showed him the photograph of Thomas. He looked at the stiff, formal portrait for a long time, then met her eyes. He said nothing, but his gaze was filled with a gentle understanding that spoke more than words. He touched the photograph lightly with one finger, then touched his own chest, a gesture of respect for the dead. In that moment, Catherine felt a pang of connection so sharp, it almost felt like betrayal. The outside world, however, was not content to leave them in peace. Marshal Murdoch became a regular visitor. He would stop by on his patrols ostensibly to check on her welfare, but his visits felt more like inspections. He brought her a small sack of coffee once, and another time a piece of venison from a recent hunt. He was charming, attentive, and deeply unnerving. His questions were casual, but always probing. "Still so quiet, Catherine?" he'd ask, leaning against the doorframe, his presence filling the small space. "Don't you get lonely out here at the edge of everything?" "I value my privacy, Flint," she would reply, her heart pounding. "Privacy is one thing, isolation is another." He'd counter, his blue eyes searching her face. "This is a dangerous land for a woman alone." One afternoon, he arrived just as Kaelin was standing near the back of the cabin. Catherine heard the marshal's footsteps and hissed a frantic, "Get down!" Kaelin moved with a fluid speed that defied his recent injuries, dropping behind the bed just as Murdoch knocked. Catherine just saw some dust on the horizon, Thought I'd make sure it wasn't headed your way, the marshal said, his eyes scanning the room. He sniffed the air. Smells different in here. I was just boiling some herbs, Marshal, she lied, her mind racing. For a tonic. His gaze fell upon the extra tin cup on her small table. Before she could say anything, he picked it up. Expecting company? No, of course not, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I like to have a spare in case one breaks. Murdoch looked at her for a long, silent moment. She could see the gears turning in his mind. He didn't believe her. Not entirely, but he had no proof. He set the cup down with a deliberate click. You be careful, Catherine, he said, his voice low and serious. Secrets have a way of getting a person killed out here. He left without another word, and Catherine sank onto a chair, her legs trembling. The real threat, however, arrived a week later. He rode into Redemption Gulch on a skeletal roan horse, a man who seemed to be made of leather and dust. He was wiry and tall, with a long duster that flapped around his boots. But it was his eyes that held the true menace. They were pale, almost colorless, and they missed nothing. He had a Hawken rifle strapped to his saddle, and a reputation that preceded him like the stench of death. His name was Silas Kane, and men called him Hawkeye for his uncanny tracking skills and his ruthlessness. He was a bounty hunter. Kane didn't ask questions so much as he listened. He spent his days in the gilded cage, nursing a single whiskey, his ears open to every scrap of gossip. He heard about the reclusive widow in the cabin at the edge of town. He heard about Marshal Murdoch's unusual interest in her, and he heard the whispers about Mangus's war party, scouring the territory for someone. One evening, Catherine was returning from the well, the heavy buckets straining her arms when she saw him. Silas Kane was leaning against the wall of the blacksmith's shop, watching her. His gaze was not like Murdoch's, which was filled with a possessive curiosity. Kane's gaze was cold, analytical, like a wolf sizing up its prey. He knew something, or he suspected. She felt his eyes on her back all the way to her cabin. That night, she told Kalen about the man. She didn't know the word for bounty hunter, so she drew a picture, a man with a rifle and another man in chains with dollar signs above his head. Kalen's face hardened. He understood immediately. He went to the window, peering out into the darkness. He was no longer a patient. He was a warrior assessing a threat. He checked the heft of the iron poker from the hearth, the only weapon he had. The hunter's moon rose full and white, bathing the landscape in an eerie light. A few nights later, Catherine was jolted awake by a soft sound outside the cabin. Kalen was already awake, standing motionless in the center of the room. Every muscle tensed. He held the poker in his hand, his eyes fixed on the door. There was a faint scratching sound at the window. Then silence. Catherine held her breath, her blood turning to ice. They waited minutes, stretching into an eternity. Then a floorboard on the small porch outside creaked. Kalen moved not toward the door, but toward the hearth. He gestured for Catherine to stay back, his eyes flashing a silent command. He was a cornered animal, but there was no fear in his stance, only a deadly focused calm. The doorknob began to turn slowly, silently. The trap was being set. The hunter was closing in. And inside the small cabin, the man known as Kalen prepared to remind the world that he was not just a wounded fugitive, but the son of a chief, a man who would not be taken easily. The secret Catherine had guarded so fiercely was about to explode. The latch clicked. The door swung inward with a low groan, revealing the tall, gaunt silhouette of Silas Kane against the stark moonlight. He held a long-barreled Colt revolver in his hand, its metal glinting. His pale eyes scanned the dark room, adjusting to the gloom. "Evening, ma'am," he rasped, his voice like stones grinding together. "Figured you were expecting me." He took a step inside, confident, predatory. "Now where is he? Let's make this easy. The boy has a handsome price on his head. Enough to get you a real nice place back east." Catherine stood frozen beside the bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I don't know what you're talking about." Kane let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Oh, I think you do. A woman alone buying up laudanum and bandages. The marshal sniffing around you like a dog in heat, which means he suspects something's off. And me, I'm the one who put a bullet in that Apache boy a month back. Tracked him for 3 days before he finally dropped. Imagine my surprise when his trail just vanished. Right around where your wagon tracks were." He took another step, his eyes darting around the cabin. "I know he's here. I can smell him." Suddenly, from the darkest corner of the room, near the hearth, there was a blur of motion. Kalen exploded from the shadows, not with a warrior's cry, but in deadly silence. He didn't charge straight at the gun. He lunged sideways, using the cabin's small table as a shield. He kicked it hard, sending the wooden table tumbling into Kane's legs. Kane cursed, stumbling backward as the table crashed into his shins. The momentary distraction was all Kalen needed. He brought the heavy iron poker down in a vicious arc, not at Kane's head, but at his gun hand. The sound of iron hitting bone was sickeningly sharp. The Colt clattered to the floor. Kane howled in pain and rage, clutching his shattered hand. But he was far from finished. With his good hand, he drew a wicked-looking Bowie knife from his belt and lunged his face a mask of fury. The cabin became a whirlwind of desperate violence. It was not a duel. It was a brutal, close-quarters struggle for survival. Kalen, armed only with the poker, was a whirlwind of fluid defense and attack, his movements economical and deadly. He parried the knife thrusts, the poker ringing against the steel blade. Kane was a brawler, fueled by greed and raw hatred, swinging the knife in wide, savage slashes. Catherine screamed as Kane's blade sliced across Kalen's arm, opening a fresh wound. Blood welled dark in the moonlight. The sight broke her paralysis. She grabbed the heaviest object she could find, the cast-iron skillet from the hearth, and brought it down with all her might on the back of Kane's head. The bounty hunter crumpled to the floor, with a grunt, stunned, but not unconscious. He rolled over, shaking his head to clear it, his pale eyes burning with murder. It was then that Marshal Flint Murdoch burst through the open doorway, his own gun drawn. What in God's name is going on in here? He took in the scene in a flash, Catherine with the skillet, the bounty hunter on the floor, and the wounded, defiant Apache standing over him. Murdoch's face, which had always held a veneer of civility for Catherine, hardened into a mask of cold fury. His gun immediately centered on Kalen's chest. "Well, well," Murdoch said, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. "Looks like my instincts were right after all, Catherine. You've been harboring a savage." "He's not a savage," Catherine cried, moving to stand partially in front of Kalen. "Silas," Murdoch said, his eyes never leaving Kalen. "I assume this is the one you've been looking for." Kane, propping himself up on one elbow, spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. "That ain't just any redskin marshal. You have no idea who you're pointing that gun at." He grinned a bloody, triumphant leer. That's Nantan, the one and only son of Chief Mangus." The name hit the room with the force of a physical blow. Catherine felt the floor drop out from under her. Nantan, not Kalen. The son of the great chief whose name was a byword for Apache resistance the man Murdoch had called a devil. The war party. They weren't just raiding. They were searching for their prince. Murdoch's eyes widened in disbelief, then gleamed with a predatory light. The capture of Mangus's son was more than just a local arrest. It was a prize that could make a man famous. It was leverage. It was power. Nantan, Murdoch breathed the name, tasting like victory. This changes things. This changes everything. He's mine, Murdoch, Kane snarled, trying to get to his feet. The bounty is mine. Your bounty is worthless now, Silas, Murdoch said coldly. This is a military matter. This is my town, my jurisdiction, and my prisoner. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats began to echo, growing steadily louder. Not one or two riders, but dozens. A low, rhythmic chanting began to drift on the night air, a sound that was both mournful and menacing. Nantan's head snapped up. A look of fierce pride and relief washed over his face. He let out a single piercing cry, not of alarm, but of summons. An answer came back from the darkness, a chorus of voices that made the very air vibrate. Marshal Murdoch's confident expression evaporated, replaced by a dawning horror. He ran to the door and peered out. His face went pale. "My God," he whispered. "It's the whole damned war party. They've surrounded the town." The riders converged not on the town center, but on the small cabin at its edge. They were ghosts in the moonlight, warriors on horseback, their faces painted for war, their rifles and lances held at the ready. At their head was a man who seemed carved from the mountain rock itself. He was older, his face a road map of battles and wisdom, his hair streaked with grey. But he sat on his horse with an undeniable authority that dwarfed everyone else. This was Chief Mangus. His eyes, fierce and intelligent, were fixed on the cabin. He was not looking at the marshal or the bounty hunter. He was looking for his son. The secret was out. The hunter was caught in his own trap. And the personal drama of a woman and her hidden fugitive had escalated into a full-blown confrontation. Redemption. Gulch was a tinderbox, and Silas Kane had just struck the match, revealing a truth that had brought the wrath of the Apache nation to Catherine Moreau's doorstep. The fire was no longer a possibility. It was here. The air in Redemption Gulch grew thick with a tension that was almost breathable, a palpable silence that swallowed all other sounds. Townsfolk, roused from their beds by the chilling alien cries, became prisoners in their own homes. Behind grimy window panes and drawn calico curtains, they watched as an army of ghosts materialized from the desert. Night, their forms stark and menacing in the moonlight. The gilded cage, usually a source of raucous noise, was as quiet as a tomb. This was not a distant rumor whispered over whiskey. This was the raw, terrifying power of the Apache nation converged upon a single insignificant point on the map. At the epicenter of this maelstrom was Catherine's humble cabin, now the improbable stage for a confrontation that could drench the dusty street in blood. Inside the standoff was a knot of conflicting desperations, a microcosm of the greater conflict. Marshal Flint Murdoch, who built his identity on the unyielding bedrock of the law, found his foundation turning to sand. Trapped between his sworn duty and a force that could annihilate him and his town without a second thought, he was a cornered animal. His face, usually florid with confidence, was pale and slick with sweat. His knuckles were white where he gripped his revolver, the barrel trembling almost imperceptibly. "Nobody moves," he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain, betraying the fear his posture tried to deny. "This is my town, my authority." Silas Kane, bleeding and humiliated on the floor, saw his world shrinking to the size of this tiny lamplit room. The bounty a sum that had promised him wealth and prestige was now a spectre mocking him. His reputation as the cunning Hawkeye was in tatters. All that remained was a raw, primal instinct for survival and a venomous rage. "Don't be a fool, Murdoch," he snarled, propping himself up on one elbow, his good hand gesturing wildly. "They're savages. Give me a rifle. We can fight our way out." "There's a price on his head. Big enough for both of us." Nantan ignored them both. To him, they were little more than buzzing flies, distractions from the only thing that mattered. His gaze was fixed on the figure of his father outside a beacon in the night. The patient was gone, burned away by the fires of adrenaline and imminent conflict. In his place stood a warrior, poised and lethal. His recently healed wound was a dull ache forgotten. He was home. "You are the fool," Nantan said, his English slow, each word deliberately chosen and laced with a cold contempt that cut deeper than Kane's knife. He looked at the marshal's trembling gun. "You think that piece of iron can stop the wind? That it can hold back the river my father has come? For you, this is over." "It's over when I say it's over," Murdoch retorted the words, sounding hollow even to his own ears. It was Catherine who broke the stalemate. She moved with a strange newfound calm, a clarity born from the crucible of the last few weeks. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it no longer controlled her. She had made a choice in the desert to save this man, and she had remade it every day since. She would not abandon it now. She walked past the marshal, past his sputtering protests, and went to the door. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, took a deep breath of the thick, tense air, and stepped out onto the porch. She raised her hands, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. The low, rhythmic chanting of the Apache warriors ceased instantly. 100 pairs of dark, unblinking eyes fixed on her. The moonlight was so bright it bleached the color from the world, casting her in a silvery, ethereal glow. She was a lone, defiant figure, a bridge between two worlds poised on the brink of war. Chief Mangus, astride his war pony, urged the animal forward a few paces. He was everything the legends claimed, a man who seemed carved from the mountain rock itself, his face a testament to a long life of struggle wisdom and unforgiving leadership. His eyes, however, were not those of a pitiless killer. They were sharp, intelligent, and currently filled with 1,000 questions as they bored into her. "He is here," Catherine called out, her voice, stronger and clearer than she thought possible. It carried across the unnatural silence a thread of reason in a tapestry of menace. "Your son. He is hurt, but he is alive." From behind her, Murdoch, emboldened by her audacity, found his voice again. "He is a prisoner of the law of this territory. I am Marshal Flint Murdoch, and I demand you disperse immediately." Mangus's gaze didn't even flicker toward the marshal. It was as if Murdoch hadn't spoken. He addressed Catherine, his own voice, deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. He spoke in his native Chiricahua, but his meaning was unmistakable. "Show me." Catherine turned her back to the chief and his warriors, and met Nantan's eyes. "Nantan," she said, using his true name for the first time. "Your father is waiting." A look of profound gratitude passed over Nantan's face. He walked to the doorway, his movements imbued with a regal grace that his simple clothes and injuries could not diminish. He stepped out onto the porch and stood beside Catherine, a silent, powerful statement of allegiance. When Mangas saw his son alive standing tall, his spirit unbroken a wave of powerful emotion washed over the chief's stoic features. It was not the triumph of a warlord, but the profound, gut-wrenching relief of a father who had feared the worst. His love for his only heir was a force more powerful than any army. He let out a single, sharp command. Instantly, a dozen of his elite warriors dismounted their movements, synchronized and disciplined. They held their rifles at a low ready, not aiming but prepared. They began to advance on the cabin. "This is not your land," Murdoch bellowed, his panic reaching a fever pitch. "I am the law. I will open fire." It was Silas Kane who made the final desperate gamble. He was a man with nothing left to lose, a creature of pure destructive impulse. With a guttural roar, he lunged for the Colt revolver lying on the floor, his one last chance to reclaim his prize or die trying. But Nantan had never taken his eyes off the threat inside the room. He moved with the fluid speed of a striking snake. He kicked the gun, sending it skittering harmlessly into a corner. Before Kane could even react, Nantan was on him, bringing his full weight down, driving the bounty hunter to the floor with a bone-jarring impact. The struggle was not a struggle at all. It was an execution of will. Nantan pinned Kane's arms with his knees, his hands gripping the man's throat, not to kill, but to control, to utterly dominate. The fight was over. Outside, Mangas gave another command. The advancing warriors swarmed the cabin. They did not rush in with war cries, but with a silent, terrifying efficiency. They surrounded the sputtering marshal, one warrior plucking the revolver from his hand as if taking a toy from a child. Murdoch stood disarmed and impotent, his authority stripped bare. His face in the moonlight was a mask of utter humiliation. The law of redemption. Gulch had just met the law of the Chiricahua and had been found wanting. Other warriors hauled the struggling, cursing Silas Kane to his feet, binding his hands with a rawhide thong. His pleas and threats were ignored. Nantan finally turned to his father. They spoke for a long moment in their own tongue, a rapid, fluid exchange. Nantan's story poured out of him, the ambush, the wound, his near death in the desert, and his rescue. His eyes flickered constantly toward Catherine, and his words about her were filled with a deep, resonant gravity that she could feel in her soul, even if she couldn't comprehend the language. When he was finished, Mangas's gaze fell upon her once more. This time, it held no questions. It held a deep, considered, and profound respect. The great chief dismounted, his movements stiff but powerful, and walked across the dusty ground to the porch. He stopped directly in front of Catherine, his presence so immense that she felt as though she were standing before a mountain. He studied her face, seeing not a white woman, an enemy, but the person who had saved the single most important thing in his world. One of his warriors, an older man with a kinder face, stepped forward to act as a translator. The man who hunts for money. The translator began, his voice flat, as he gestured to the terrified Silas Kane, is a coyote that eats the dead. He has spilled the blood of the Ende on sacred ground for the sake of metal discs. He will be dealt with by our law. Kane's face went ashen. He understood he was a dead man. The translator turned his gaze to the defeated marshal. The man of paper laws is a little dog who barks at the storm. He is full of noise and puffed-up pride, but he has no real power. He is nothing. We leave him to his insignificance, a chief of a town of dust. Then the warrior and the chief turned their full attention to Catherine. The translator's tone softened, imbued with the gravity of his chief's words. "But you," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "You found the heir to the Chiricahua nation dying in the dirt. Your people would have left him for the vultures or celebrated his death. You took him into your home. You cleaned his wounds. You gave him your food and your water. You hid him from his enemies at a risk to your own life that we understand completely. You have shown a courage and an honor that transcends blood. You have created a debt that cannot be paid with horses or silver." Mangas stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his actions clear. He reached to a pouch at his side and withdrew a single flawless eagle feather. It was tied at its base with a strip of soft deerskin and a bead of brilliant blue turquoise. He held it out to her in his open palm. Catherine, her hand trembling slightly, reached out and accepted the sacred gift. It felt warm and alive in her grasp. "The Nunde, the people will not forget this day," the translator said, his voice resonating with the weight of a solemn oath. "The name Catherine Moreau will be spoken with honor in our camps and at our council fires. You will always have safe passage in our lands. From this day forward, you are Izan Aklan, a sister to the Apache." Nantan came to stand beside his father, his role as a son restored. He looked at Catherine, and in the deep, dark pools of his eyes, she saw everything he could not say. There was the boundless gratitude of a man who had been brought back from the brink of death, the deep respect of one warrior for another, and something more, a tender, powerful connection forged in the crucible of their shared secret, a bond that defied the chasm between their worlds. "Thank you, Catherine," he said, the two simple English words carrying the weight of 1,000 Apache blessings. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently brush his fingers against the eagle feather she held. His touch was electric, a final, fleeting acknowledgement of their intimacy. "Do not stay in this place," he advised, his voice low and urgent. "This is a bitter land for a person with a good heart. Go north. The mountains are kinder. There is more water there." With a final lingering look, he turned to join his father. The Apaches mounted their horses. As silently and mysteriously as they had arrived, they melted back into the desert night, taking Silas Kane and the shadows with them. They left behind a terrified town, a broken marshal, and a woman whose life and whose very soul had been irrevocably changed. The next morning, as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the street, Redemption Gulch felt different. It felt smaller, more fragile. Catherine did not linger. She packed her few belongings into the wagon, her movements deliberate and final. She took the photograph of Thomas and wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth. Beside it, she placed the eagle feather. She led her mules to the general store, where a wide-eyed Mr. Abernathy sold her the supplies she needed, without a single prying question. He, like the rest of the town, simply stared at her with a new, fearful awe. She was the woman who had communed with the ghosts and lived. Without a word to Murdoch, without a final glance at the cabin that had been both her prison and her sanctuary, she snapped the reins. Cain and Abel plodded forward, pulling the wagon north away from the harsh desert and toward the promise of Kinder Mountains. She never saw Nantan again, but she carried him with her in the weight of the eagle feather, in the memory of his quiet strength, and in the unspoken truth of what had passed between them. The quiet widow from St. Louis had gambled everything on a new life, and in a way she never could have imagined she had won. She had found her own true and untamed redemption. Catherine Moreau went looking for a new start, but found a new soul. Her story isn't just a tale of the Old West. It's a testament to the extraordinary courage that can be found in an ordinary heart. It reminds us that the deepest divides can be bridged by a simple act of compassion, and that true honor is not defined by the laws of men, but by the choices we make when no one is watching. If this story of defiance, risk, and unexpected connection moved you, please help our channel grow by giving this video a like. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more true-life dramas and hidden histories from the untamed frontier. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the trail for the next chapter.